It was a celebration to mark the 88th National Day of Saudi Arabia, an annual historic event celebrated to commemorate the renaming of a kingdom of Najd and Hijaz to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by a royal decree from King Abdulaziz ibn Saud in 1932. Ambassador of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to Kenya, Dr Mohammed Khayat, leading diplomats and senior government officials, including Foreign Affairs Diplomatic Secretary Ambassador Tom Mamolo, in marking the historic day.
We have had several fruitful engagements and exchanges with the government of the Republic of Kenya.
Kenya and Saudi Arabia enjoy very good relations, which traverse history, culture, and religion. And we've been able to grow this relationship in a way that has boosted our respective economies and ties.
Khayat lauding diplomatic milestones realized by Kenya and Saudi Arabia. This even as he promised more support from his government, including the approval of a 2.5 billion shillings grant for the construction of a new road project, the Modogashe-Wajir road.
That the Saudi Arabian government has approved a financial grant of $25 million for the construction of a new road project, the Modogashe-Wajir road.
Other areas that the Saudi government promised to cooperate with Kenya include agriculture, irrigation, trade, mining, industry, and livestock.
In November 2017, the Saudi Food Drug Authority delegation visited Kenya and held discussion with ministers of agriculture, trade and industry, and livestock and fisheries on several ways of enhancing cooperation on food security.
And with concern over the treatment of Kenyans working in the Gulf nation, Khayat said his government is in talks with the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection in efforts aimed at improving labor opportunities and decent working conditions, especially for the domestic workers in Saudi Arabia.
Talks were held with the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection on improving labor opportunities and decent work conditions, especially for the domestic workers in Saudi Arabia.
That more concerted efforts will be deployed to ameliorate and stop the work-related issues that emanate from over 20,000 Kenyan nationals working, living, and studying in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I'm very happy, Your Excellency, that you have done a lot of good work to make sure that this is in place.